I was watching this week an interview that was being held by William Shatner, who was the Captain Kirk in the original Star Trek. I mean, he's in his 90s now. He's a remarkable man, really. And actually, I was quite intrigued. He's quite a humble man, actually, when you start listening to him. And I think certainly his trip into space recently, into orbit, really did a lot for him. And he seems to have calmed right down. And he was interviewing all the guys and girls that have been Star Trek captains, you see. And some of them, well, I mean, they're right off the pavement, you know, but one or two were okay. And one of my favourites is Patrick Stewart. One, because he's a brilliant actor. But secondly, the character he portrays, he brings something to it. And there's, I don't know, there's just something about him that I really like. Anyway, they were having this chat about how that's affected their lives and how the role has changed them. And of course, the role in each case has brought them a great deal of success, an awful lot of money, and their lives have changed incredibly. But then they started talking about how acting personally affected their lives. And William Shatner was talking about the hours that they have to work. I mean, I didn't realise that sometimes they were working up to 23 hours a day just to produce one episode of Star Trek, to get it right. And they wouldn't let them leave the lot until it was done. Even if you had a child who was sick at home, you couldn't go and make a phone call. You were there. You were contracted to be there. You had to be there. That's why they paid them the big bucks, after all. And of course, that naturally had an effect on families. And William Shatner was started talking about the cost personally to him and how there had been 2 marriage breakdowns for him and family breakdowns, and how that had brought him a lot of sadness. And then he said to Patrick Stewart, oh, what about you? I mean, how did it affect you? He said, yeah, I've had a couple of divorces and broken homes, and said it was quite hard. And I said, all right. And he said, but how did that affect you? And Patrick Stewart, being the type of man he is, he sat and reflected, and he said, well, you know, he said, I remember years ago when I was younger, and I was in a conversation with a whole load of other actors. And people were saying, it's always family first with me. I've got to protect my family. And people were going around the room talking about it. He said, and I thought to myself, not me. My career comes first. And William Shatner said to him, doesn't that upset you? And his response shocked me, actually. He says, no. He said, actually, I'm very comfortable with my own company. I thought it was shocking to hear that for someone so successful and thoughtful. But let me tell you about 3 businessmen who were discussing the definition of success. And the first one said, I'd consider myself a success if I was summoned to 10 Downing Street for a private consultation with the Prime Minister. The second one chipped in and said, well, actually, the definition of success will be meeting with the Prime Minister, and then the telephone hotline rings during our discussion, and the Prime Minister ignores it so he can spend time with me. And the third one said, you're both wrong, you know. The definition of success is when you're in the middle of private talks with the Prime Minister, the hotline rings, he picks it up and he says, it's for you. High self-esteem is believing that you have a rightful place in the universe. But egotism, a sense of self-importance, is believing that you are the center of the universe. And this is what I've been seeing all this week, funny enough, as I've been preparing this. And so my first heading this morning for you is this: the blindness of self-importance. You see, it's an incredible fact that the world that we live in, with all of its skepticism, is happier to accept the truth as it's portrayed on our television set or in the newspaper, or even in the rumor control, which seems to govern how we react or at which temperature we operate, rather than accept any change in a man or a woman's life which has been revolutionary and or liberating. Maybe it's because many of us, if not all of us, to some degree, like to think that we make an impact on those around us. And then in this sort of power delusion that we fit into, we feel at home with ourselves, certain that we are in control. Now this cynicism seems to permeate our society. And all too often it eats away into our being, so that before long nothing that we hear is believed or accepted or even taken on face value. In fact, in our postmodern society, much is not denied, if that doesn't sound like too much of a paradox. Instead, a post-mortem is required, but no easy answer is acceptable. So what I'm trying to say is that even when the truth is as plain as a nose on your face, because of an inability to accept and or trust, we deny ourselves any real experience that could change the course of our lives forever. Instead, what we do is we retreat into those safe havens of familiarity. Those things which we've created, those places where we are in control and where our decision is the one that counts. Of course, the craving for power and importance, the need to dominate in any given situation, there's nothing new in that concept. In fact, it's as old as we are and more, because selfish, independent nature, or sin, is the terminal illness of mankind. Our behaviour is, of course, symptomatic of our condition. Did you know the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that more basic than all the human needs is the desire to control one's own destiny, to be free to realise one's full potential without restraints from anyone, to be free from all the limitations, to transcend the prescriptions of the society and of God, and to shrug off responsibility for others if that responsibility interferes with their own goals. He then goes on to say that he rejects the notion of God because he couldn't tolerate the thought of anyone being more powerful than himself. Then he goes on and says, if there were gods, we would have to slay them out of jealousy. I wonder, does that sound familiar? Well, it ought to, because that is the picture of what we in our society and in our world have done. You've only just got to look at the newspaper, look at the international scene, demonstrating the state that nations are in socially and economically. The desire to exert power and control. And the media is a real good example of that, as they feed us a selection of news. Then there's the justification of armed conflict, and even the hint that it's a righteous cause. And yet, you know something, if I was a gambling man, I would put money on the fact that God has not been consulted. At present, we've got 20 wars going on in our world. Did you know that? The recent one's number 20, by the way. 20 wars. And we've made ourselves master by changing and adapting our attitudes and our values so that we decide that which is right and which is wrong, and we determine the criteria for change and development. That is the blindness of self-importance. But then, of course, we see the freedom of healing. Now, here we are in John chapter 9. And we can see how the religious leaders of the day have slipped into this mire of self-determination and have become so blind to what God was doing in their midst, so that the only response that they could offer to this miracle was suspicion and fear. Our blind friend in our story is just an ordinary bloke. You might say he was just a victim of his society and the twisted beliefs that were there. You see, anyone who was born with a disability was regarded to be the result of someone else's sin, someone else's wrongdoing. And so they were consigned to a life of begging. Now, we know in Jewish society they did provide for folk who were in this situation, but these folk couldn't go to worship, you know, they couldn't get a job. It was just awful, really. So in verse 1, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? This is where they are. And the vital question was asked by them because they wanted to know where Jesus stands on this. And he says, well, look, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it's day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Remember, he just said this at the Feast of Tabernacles. After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now this area was always guaranteed to have a crowd. Siloam, as we've just read, is a word which means sent. And the reason it's called the pool of Siloam, or the pool of the sent, is this. Centuries before Jesus' time, during the reign of King Hezekiah, and we find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, there was an Assyrian king called Sennacherib. And I'll show you a picture of his kingdom. Now, it's not a very clear picture, but what you can see around the orange line, that was the Assyrian kingdom at that point. Now, of course, Jerusalem is away down here. So imagine the size of that force sweeping down that continent, and they were going to attack Jerusalem. Now, the king, Hezekiah, realized that if these people turn up and they lay siege to Jerusalem, then they're going to be stuck, because the water source was found just outside the city walls. And so he commissioned his engineers to dig a tunnel through solid rock to reach this and bring the water inside. That tunnel, would you believe, was 583 yards. And if you want it in modern speak, it's 533 metres. I don't do metres, centimetres, I do pounds and pence, and pounds, shillings and pence still. I'm still there. Okay. And when the water that flowed in, it came into a pool that was 30 feet wide by 50 feet long. Imagine the work in that. And there's an artist's impression of the pool, right? Now this was known as the Pool of Siloam because the water had been sent in from outside the city walls. Great, well it makes sense, doesn't it? It was also regarded as sent because God provided it in a time of need. And what I love about that picture was God provided it, but they had to work for it. Okay, so it means you haven't got to sit still and say, oh, that's all right, God's going to do it for us. We've got to go and put some effort in as well, which they obviously did. So by the time the Assyrians have travelled all the way down the continent and they get there, they laid siege, and of course the Jerusalem was okay. So the pool became known as a place of help. And there would always be a rabbi stationed there to offer some ministry and maybe some advice. And also it brings into focus the pouring of the water of tabernacles, celebrating the provision of God in the history of the nation. And what we have here in the text is very appropriate because Jesus was healing the blind man in the place where the water came from and that was sent from God. You see what's happening? Now, why saliva? Well, the medical experts of the day believed that saliva possessed unique healing properties. And a Roman writer called Pliny wrote an entire chapter about it in one of his books. And he said that saliva was supposed to be able to cure all sorts of illnesses, everything from headaches and eye diseases to foot ailments and even leprosy. And often doctors would anoint wounds and sick parts of the body with medicines dissolved in saliva in the belief that this would enhance the effectiveness of the drugs. Now you're glad for the NHS, aren't you? Now what's good about Jesus' actions here in this passage is that he symbolically took the elements that were common in the society so that people would pay attention. We know that he didn't need saliva, he could have just healed the man, but it teaches us too an important lesson regarding our starting point with others when we're sharing our faith with them. We meet them where they are, in the area where they understand. Now imagine what it must have been like. This guy is walking along the road making his way to the pool with mud on his face, and people were thinking someone's playing a game and making a fool of him. Then as he washes his face, his sight returns. Now just imagine what that must have been like. He's never seen before. It's always been darkness. He's never experienced light before. I wonder what his reaction was like to seeing a fellow human being. He's only been fulfilled before. So what I want you to do is just look at the person next to you. Just look at the person next to you. You can look. Now imagine if this was the first person you ever seen. How does that make you feel? Well, I don't want answers to the question. That's a rhetoric question, okay. Is there a sense of wonder there? I mean, so when you close your eyes, just think about when you wake up in the morning, if you're married, and you wake up in the morning, it's all dark and your eyes are closed. You open up and you look at your husband and wife. Is there a sense of wonder? Wow. My wife feels a sense of wonder whenever she sees me. I understand that. You see, for him, the sounds and the smells, they will be the same. So there would be this familiarity, but now he could see. Everything was new and real, and his life would never be the same. And at this point, I think we've got to really consider again the picture of the Feast of Tabernacles, the water from the pool of Siloam. And now this man is receiving, added to that, not only sight, but light as well. Now this is great for the man, but the symbolism of all of this wouldn't have been wasted on the people that were there. Look at verse 8. His neighbours then, and those who had formerly seen him beg, and asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "He was." Well, others said, "No, he just looks like him." But he insisted, "I am the man." How then were your eyes opened? We said, "The man called Jesus came and put some mud on my face and my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash, and I went and washed, and I could see." So where is he? He said, "Well, I don't know." It's a bit of a daft question, really. This man's never seen anyone before. Of course he's met Jesus, but he's never seen him. So how would he know where Jesus is? How would he know who the bloke sitting next to him was? He didn't even know him. He's spoken to him for years, but he's never seen him. Well, his neighbours were just a bit sceptical, weren't they? After they'd seen him only this morning begging, is this some kind of practical? This is a wind-up, isn't it? Well, if I'd have been involved, it probably would have been a wind-up. But it's not really him. It just looks like him. You know, ever since our friend has received his sight, have you considered even his features have changed? There's a wholeness about him that people haven't seen before. He's no longer this beggar that gropes his way through life, shunned by many and relying on charity to survive. Now he is whole. He could see. His perspective was so clear. And now he could start living. Now he could attend worship. Now he could get married. Now he could go to work. The possibilities for him are so endless. He is free. And the power of others exerted to control all the direction of his life was now gone. All the shackles of his life have been taken away, and now he's a new being. And the world is full of wonder. Now clearly the people who saw this, they were a bit suspicious, but they were quite uncomfortable. And instead of rejoicing and being glad that this miracle's happened, they were suspicious. Who, what, why, when, where? This was something that had to be handled carefully, you know. Perhaps he's got something catching. Suppose I will have to change, or I can't have that, can I? And I think we can all identify with that sentiment, can't we? When we encounter the enthusiasm of someone who has met Jesus for the first time, maybe. And we've been on the way a long time, and we see that enthusiasm, and they've got this clarity, wow, to see their life clean and free. And we feel uncomfortable because we've slipped into our mode of our operating procedures, and we know how we're going to do things. We know what fits. We know what doesn't fit. And suddenly there's this freedom that we once had but has now become a shackle to us. And gladly he just tells them the story. And their response, oh, I pull the other one. And of course things go from bad to worse, don't they? So they call in the experts. Now imagine this scene. Here's this poor guy with this good news, and around him is a crowd of people interested in a bit of scandal, but not interested in his good news. And I wonder if there was a series of tests. How many fingers am I holding up? How many people are here? I haven't got a clue, but it's lovely to see you. Let me tell you what happened to me today. See, the blindness of self-importance prevented them from seeing the truth. And the freedom of healing was right in front of them, but they lacked the light of spiritual sight. And that was the challenge. And of course, the concern from the Pharisees, these religious leaders, was to find out who had healed him. It was out of their control, and that's the word, isn't it? It was there again. And instead of giving thanks to God that this man has been released from his difficulty, there's one less beggar on the street, they panicked about their reputation. And they were asking questions like, I wonder if someone's mounting a takeover bid. And rather like a group of politicians, they looked for a weak point in the story to exploit. And after hearing the story again, they've got it. Look at verse 16, just the beginning of it. It says, some of the Pharisees said, well, this man is not from God, for he doesn't keep the Sabbath. And of course, then the backbenchers rebelled, don't they? And they said, but how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. This is no good, they decided. We've got to do something. Let's get the bloke in. So they pulled him in and said, right then, what have you got to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. Well, and of course he does it, doesn't he? He's a prophet. Oh, that's torn it. They're not happy with that response, and they still didn't believe then that he'd been blind from received his sight until the man's parents come in. Now, is this your boy? Is this the one you say was born blind? How can he now see? Now they're frightened because, if they do all the answering, they're going to get thrown out of church, aren't they? They're going to be thrown out of their community. They're not going to have a future. So they're torn between the community and their child. And they said, well, we know he's our son, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see or who opened his eyes, well, we don't know the answer to that, but ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself. Now, they said that because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, and we know why. Everyone there knew fine well who Jesus was. And then there's another round. Only this time they get sort of a religious blackmail comes into it. Look at verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God, they said, by telling the truth. Hasn't he been doing that all along? We know this man is a sinner, and he must have been getting really fed up with them. And so he answers, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. The one thing I do know is I was blind, but now I can see. So what are you going to do with that? Well, the story continues, but I'm going to have to stop it there. I just want us to consider just how contemporary this story is. Sure, we don't have exactly the same situation today, do we? Well, I think it would appear from what we know of our human condition that there are many instances of this individual's experience going on daily, if not hourly, in the modern world. There's come a point where those affected have met Jesus Christ, and in that encounter, they've received a spiritual sight. And suddenly they can perceive their life and their surroundings and their relationships in a way that they could never have done before. And this experience is so revolutionary that all we want to do, rather like that blind man, is to go and share the good news with everyone that we meet. What were you like when you were first converted, eh? Whoa. Oh, it was a problem, I can tell you. I went home, and the first thing I did was I dangled my parents over the fires of hell. That's the first thing I did. My father threw me out of the house, and my bag and my Bible followed me. It took me 20 years, to get back to talk to him about the gospel. But when you get that clarity and you want to share, and you don't understand how to pass that message on, And the skeptics are exactly the same, aren't they? For all manner of reasons, but I suspect one of the major reasons is that they're challenged in their own heart in respect to their spiritual state. Isn't it true, when we meet someone who is clean, we feel soiled? And of course, our defense mechanisms come up, don't they? I'm just as good as they are. I'm happy with the way I am. I'm not giving in. I'll change when I'm good and ready. I don't need what they have. But do you know something? You do and you know it. But you run because you're afraid of change, and you put as many obstacles between you and your need. And I find it quite amusing. It's a kind of delay tactic so that God won't catch up with you. And all the while you live your life giving the impression that you're in complete control. You know, spiritual blindness has at its heart a stubborn resistance to the Word of God. And an utter refusal to look at the facts honestly. There's this inability to climb down from a position of pride and say that a mistake was made and a rethink was done because we were too full of ourselves. You know, in an interview with a man called Michael Wilding, who was an actor, he was once asked if actors have any traits which set them apart from other human beings. Without a doubt, he said, you can pick out the actors in a crowd by the glazed look that comes into their eyes when the conversation wanders away from themselves. I don't think it's just actors, you know. Because we've all got an ego that needs massaging, haven't we? And just like the man in our story, we are blind. The problem is that we're so used to the life of acting, focused on ourselves, looking out for number one. And do you know what we're like, really? We're just like a bunch of beggars. Happy to accept the scraps that are thrown to us, believing that this is the way it will always be, and hanging on to the faint hope that things might get a little bit better. We're so immersed in this lie that our luck will change and that it's all down to fate, that when Jesus Christ stands before us, we don't even perceive that he's there. And even if we do feel something different, our senses are so dulled by life in the spiritual gutter that we ignore him. So ask the questions. How many times have we met folk, or maybe you're one of them, who speak of escaping from all their circumstances? Lives preoccupied with the darkness that they're in, and clearly what is needed is light so that we can see. We need to honestly see all that we are, and then we need to see Jesus and all that he wants to do with our broken heart and our lostness. His desire is that we are released from the prison of emptiness and that we gain a perception of reality so that we can become clean, and so that we can become free people that we're meant to be, men and women who can see. You know, this story is so relevant as we read it. His blindness, you know, it wasn't just external, it was an internal blindness as well. And it seems really quite ironic to me. The man who was born blind from birth could actually see more than those who had had sight all their days. This blindness, of course, comes from all sorts of distractions that take over our existence. And we could name them, couldn't we? Our house, our car, our golf, our fishing, our relationships, our money. And these things are not intrinsically wrong or bad. But it's the place that we give them in our lives that can be. And our refusal to conform, to maintain our independence, emphasizing our selfishness in their control. Now, I wonder, if we're honest, if there is anyone here who's not allowing something to govern their lives. Just how realistic are we when it comes to assessing ourselves? Even in the most brutal examination, there are still those moments when the truth becomes apparent. But too often we kid ourselves on that all is well, or well enough. So that our spiritual lives have a tendency to list like a leaky ship, you know? And we think it's automatically going to correct itself. We don't need to plug any holes, do we? We're wrong. living in a state of self-reliance, looking for our own answers produces fear and it produces disorientation. So are you blind? Do you want to see? Do you want to be clean? Do you want light in your life? Do you want a real perspective? Because if you do, Jesus Christ is here and he's willing to heal you right now. Our response in the face of the critic has got to be the acceptance of Jesus' healing and then that confession. One thing I know, I was blind, but now I can see. And we'll continue next week. Shall we pray together?